Hi folks, in this video we are going to talk about economic indicators. What are they and what are the most common ones? How are they used? And what do we need to know about them to understand how they apply in rural Alaska? So economic indicators are pieces of economic data that are used to judge the overall health of an economy. Common indicators include things like the gross domestic product, or GDP, unemployment, and the consumer price index, which measures inflation or how quickly prices increase. We'll spend a little time on GDP and unemployment in this video. GDP measures the value of all final goods and services produced within a country in a given year. It's essentially an indicator of how big the economy is or how much economic activity is happening within a country. It hasn't been around forever. It was just adopted commonly in 1944. It was created by a gentleman named Simon Kuznets, who was a U.S. economist. And there are a couple ways to calculate it. The formula you would see most often if you're taking an introductory macroeconomics course would show the demand formula, which calculates the total dollar value of what consumers, businesses, and government purchase in the economy, with some adjustments for exports and imports. There are a couple other concepts that are very, very closely related to GDP, like the gross national product, which just reflects the value of all the goods and services American businesses produce, whether they produce it in the US or abroad. So a little subtle distinction between GDP or gross state product. You'll hear me say like Alaska's GDP. Technically, I should probably say Alaska's GSP, gross state product, but similar thing, just instead of for a country, it's per state. GDP per capita is just the GDP divided by the population of a given country or place. And you'll sometimes hear me say this as per capita income. While GDP does give you a crude measure of how much economic activity is happening in a place, it doesn't really give you a direct indication of the standard of living in a place. Usually as GDP per capita increases, the standard of living increases in a place. And what do I mean by a standard of living? The standard of living includes all elements that affect people's happiness and well-being, whether they're bought and sold in the market or not. So GDP doesn't reflect the value of leisure time. It doesn't reflect a lot of public goods like a cleanly environment or public health. It doesn't reflect the value of things that aren't produced on the market, exchanged on a market. So subsistence activities in rural Alaska, such as hunting and gathering, won't be included there. Providing childcare for your own kids or for relatives, but without cash trading hands, wouldn't be included in GDP. It doesn't reflect anything about the level of inequality happening in a society. There's another metric called the Gini coefficient that does give us an indication of inequality, but the GDP itself doesn't really tell us anything about that. It doesn't tell you anything about the technology or products that are available. So like, what are those goods and services that people are actually buying? What's the quality of them? We have no indication of that at all. So that's why I say GDP is the most common measure, but also a crude measure. To put this in the context of Alaska, and these are entire Alaska, not rural Alaska numbers, because we don't have recent rural Alaska numbers. And that's another challenge with GDP, is it's difficult to measure at a more localized level. Usually you might find it at a state level, but it's hard to oftentimes find it at even a municipal or borough level. So 2022, US GDP was 25.5 trillion. Alaska GDP was 49.6 billion. So Alaska contributed about 1/500th of the US's GDP. That's to be expected a little bit. You wouldn't think, even though there's 50 states, that they produce 1/50th of the US's GDP because we're a low population density state. So we don't have that many people. US per capita GDP was about $70,000. Alaska per capita GDP was $74,000. So you see, on average, Alaskans earn more, or GDP per capita is higher in Alaska than the rest of the US, but that number also doesn't account for the high cost of living in Alaska. And then finally, GDP growth for 2022 was 2.1% in the overall US economy, but the Alaskan economy actually shrank by 2.4%. So to make these numbers meaningful, and when you start looking at numbers in some of the assignments, I ask you to look at numbers in this class, you'll probably want to look at more than just 1 year, if possible, to make good comparisons across time, but we only looked at a snapshot in time here. And why would Alaska's GDP shrink when the US's GDP is growing? Alaska's economy is especially sensitive to oil prices. And when we delve in I think not next week, but the week after, into some of the common industries and sectors in Alaska, we'll talk a little bit more about that. So what causes GDP to grow? This is another number that people talk about a lot, is GDP growth. So 4 big factors: the size of your workforce, so how many working age people do you have? The level of human capital, so that's the accumulated knowledge from education and experience, skills and expertise that the average worker in an economy possesses. So essentially, do you have a lot of people with advanced degrees doing white-collar work, or do you have an economy where most people attain basic level of education and do kind of lower skill work, or somewhere on the spectrum in between the two? The higher your human capital, the more likely or the quicker your pace of economic growth. Physical capital. So this has to do with infrastructure, like plant and equipment, roads, rail systems, those kinds of things, as opposed to the human aspect. So the higher quality of your physical capital, or the more physical capital you have, the faster pace of economic growth. And finally, technology. So sometimes you can use the same inputs and produce more output. And the magic there is the technology, the way in which existing inputs produce more or higher quality, as well as different and altogether new products. So again, size of your workforce, human capital, physical capital, and technology are the 4 important factors for economic growth. So finally, looking at unemployment, first, we should say unemployment is a more nuanced measure than maybe you think it is, because if you actually look at the population of a place, first you only count in the labor force, so the available adults who are able to work, people usually between 15 and 65 is the age bracket. So kids are left out of that number for the labor force. So that adult population is then broken down into a few other segments. So there are the employed folks who are currently working, unemployed, which are those who are out of work but actively looking for a job, and those who are called discouraged workers or out of the labor force, those who are not working and not looking for work, whether they want employment or not. So those people are actually not even counted in the labor force. So when we look at the unemployment rate in a place, it calculates the percent of adults who are in the labor force and thus seeking jobs, but who do not have jobs. So people who are discouraged workers, maybe were out of work so long that they decided to give up and not look for work anymore, won't be counted in that denominator at all for the unemployment rate. People who are unemployed by choice, not looking for work, people who maybe engage in significant subsistence activities, and thus are only employed seasonally, might also not be counted in the labor force, depending on when the measure is taken. Contract work, a lot of unconventional forms of employment may not also be reflected in these statistics. So they again are a crude measure that tell you a little something about the labor force, but not everything.